All right, I know we still have folks coming in, but we're going to get started. Hi, I'm Faye Hanleybrown, and Jen Jester's also joining me for this workshop. Welcome to the working session on evaluating collective impact. Now, it's probably no mistake that we've got a pretty full room here. And I would say that as we have seen communities really begin to implement, to do the work of collective impact, the questions that they're asking shift pretty quickly from what is collective impact to how the heck do I evaluate it? And so that's really what we'd like to focus on today. We have funders and other stakeholders looking for evidence of progress. Where's the evidence that we're making traction and progress towards the common agenda? We have practitioners that are looking for quality, consistent, timely data that helps them to inform their decision making, right? So there are many different actors in this work that are looking for information that helps them to improve. And I love this New Yorker cartoon. So if you can see in the back of the room, it's a pack of wolves, and they're all howling at the moon. And one wolf turns to the other wolf and he says, my question is, are we making impact? And I know some of us may feel like we're this pack of wolves sometimes. But the fact is that one of the things that makes collective impact different from typical collaboration is that there is a common goal. There is measurable outcomes that we're trying to get to. And ultimately, the whole point of this work is to get to large-scale social impact that is measurable. And so therefore, evaluating collective impact is really important. It is quite different, again, from typical collaborations. But evaluation in collective impact context is very different from the traditional paradigm of evaluation, right? So the traditional paradigm of evaluation is you take a single organization or a single program and you try to isolate the impact of that one organization or that one program over time. Well, in collective impact, what we're trying to do is to evaluate the efforts of multiple organizations over time to try and solve a common problem. And this is really emergent work. It is very messy. It is very long-term. It is really looking at systems change. It is a very different way of approaching evaluation from the way that we typically do in the social sector. And it's important to remember that collective impact itself is not a solution, right? Collective impact is a problem-solving process. And that through collective impact, you have all the different stakeholders really having to pay attention to how the context is shifting, because it's constantly shifting, getting data and information about what's working and what isn't across organizations, and really being able to collectively adapt as you go. Again, John talked about that collective seeing, learning, and doing. And that's what we need in collective impact. That's what we need from evaluation and from data. So what's really important in evaluation in the context of collective impact then is learning. This is really about creating a learning system and a learning approach that helps us to do our work better over time. The other thing that we have seen in the field is that there is a lot of confusion around evaluating collective impact and shared measurement, right? In many cases, these two things are being conflated, and they're two different things. We're going to talk about both of those today. In fact, both of these, both evaluating collective impact and shared measurement, are really important to successful collective impact efforts. But it's helpful, I think, to unpack them a bit and pull them apart. So just very briefly, shared measurement systems are one of the 5 conditions, right, for collective impact. It's essentially what is that small set of discrete measures that everyone agrees to is going to help you move towards that common agenda, that common goal. And you consistently measure that data over time, and it tells you what is the progress we're making. What progress are we making? That's what shared measurement tells you, okay? But it doesn't necessarily tell you why or how you're making progress. And that's where evaluation comes in. So if the shared measures are telling you what progress you're making, the evaluation activities, which are more broad, and it's a whole suite of activities and data and information that you're gathering, are telling you why and how you're making progress or not. And there's an interesting relationship between these two, between shared measurement and evaluation. And in fact, the shared measurement can be an input to evaluation, right? So you look at how those shared measures are moving, and then you go and investigate why that's happening. You can also evaluate shared measures. You know, shared measurement is a core component of collective impact, so you might want to be evaluating whether or not you have the right shared measures, or whether or not the different stakeholders are actually bought into and using these shared measures to course correct. So there's a really interesting relationship between shared measurement and evaluation, which is important to understand, but they're two different things that are both really, really helpful in collective impact. So what we wanted to do today was really to go into both of these. Jen is going to talk a bit about a framework for evaluating collective impact that we've been developing with our colleagues. And then I'm going to talk a bit about shared measures and tips and tricks. How do you identify them? How do you get buy-in to them? How do you use them? So we want to touch on both of these in this session. But I want to stop before we go too far just to make sure that we're hearing your burning questions around these topics and to make sure we can try and touch on these as we go. So what are you guys interested in learning? Yeah, over here.
This is not exactly about what I'm interested in learning, but I'm wondering if the slides will be made available for us.
Yes, absolutely. And all the slides over the 3 days will be available to everybody. So don't feel the need to scribble notes. Yeah, they'll all be available. And you have some handouts on your tables around this as well. Burning questions around evaluating collective impact or shared measurement? Yeah.
Just a quick question. Each organization that comes to this collective impact backbone organization has their own measurements that and that's not going to change. Yep. So the backbone helps us all, I'm just clarifying, the backbone then helps us all decide what is that one measurement among all of us that we're going to really focus in on, that we can all share in? Or is it you guys have to change your measurements to be this one or these three?
Right.
I mean, how the complexity between moving in and out of my own responsibilities to my funders and being a part of that
broader collaborative. Yeah,
yes,
it's a great question, and we will get to that when we talk about how to establish shared measures. A very short answer to that is the backbone helps to facilitate a process by which the stakeholders agree to that small set of measures. It doesn't mean they stop measuring everything else either. So, you know, but that's a great question. How do you deal with the fact that so many folks have their own measures that they're measuring? You know, go back to the Calgary homeless example, right? 10,000 measures in Calgary around homelessness. We see that around almost every issue in almost every community, right? Yeah.
Here. Will you be getting developmental evaluation too?
We will definitely be talking about developmental evaluation, particularly in the context of evaluating early stages of collective impact. Yes. Yep, here.
Okay. In my last workshop, they talked about an evaluation of the evaluation, and I don't know what that means, so that would be interesting to hear.
Yeah.
And then as a funder, where does sort of gauging the performance of the funder and appropriate power balance fit into measures?
Yeah, great question. So where do the funders fit in here? Yep. Other questions? We'll take two more. Yes, here.
Yeah. Yep. We work with a lot of small service providers who don't often keep records of data of the work we're doing, and I'm wondering if you might touch on how we evaluate the work like that.
Right, and so it sort of gets back to some of the conversations we've been having about capacity, right? And the capacity to collect and use the data. Absolutely. Yep. And then back here, all right, you two.
I think this is more of a request, and something that I hear from a lot of people is just the idea of getting to shared measurement systems seems overwhelming and scary. And looking at how that's illustrated there, I really appreciate you pulling out and explaining the difference between SMS and evaluation, but maybe helping us feel like there's something that we can do. What are the chunks that we could, where do we start?
Yep.
And how can you set up SMS and evaluation at the same time?
Yep. Yeah.
And not
Great
be overwhelmed
question.
by the depth and breadth of it.
That's a great question. Yeah. So we'll actually be talking about that in both parts. Jen's going to talk about the evaluating CI framework, which essentially is a way to help you figure out where to start from an evaluation standpoint. And then I'll be talking about, from a shared measurement standpoint, what we've seen as literally tips and tricks for getting this done. So we will be touching on both of those. Yeah, great. All right, well, let's jump into this. And again, please, we'd love to make this as back and forth and dynamic as possible. If you have questions, raise your hand as we go into this. But I'm going to turn it over to Jen to get us started with evaluating collective impact.
Great. So as Faye mentioned, the folks at FSG who work on collective impact and our colleagues from our strategic learning and evaluation team have been putting our heads together to think about how to help the field understand and advance its practice in evaluating collective impact. And so this is a preview of a new guide, actually, that we'll be publishing in the coming months on how to evaluate collective impact. So this is a sneak preview, and know that there's a lot more detail behind this that will be made available, much more than we could share in a 90-minute session. So that is sort of a context for where this framework and thinking comes from. So when we started thinking about how do we get our heads around the question of evaluating collective impact, we began by saying, what is the framework, or forgive me, the theory of change that helps inform how collective impact processes unfold, lead to change in communities or systems, and ultimate impact? And what we've put together here, it looks actually very simple, but took a lot of conversation to get on the same page for how do we want to organize the flow of activities as they go from designing process to systems change to ultimate impact. Across the top is sort of a time and impact continuum. There intentionally are not specific numbers of months or years on there. However, think of it as a sequential process over time. Surrounding the boxes, we have a big light blue box that we're labeling context. And in thinking about evaluation, I think it's very helpful to start about thinking what is the context in which our initiative is happening. And when we think about asking evaluation questions and looking for progress, always knowing the context in which the initiative happens is extremely important. So with context, we're talking about things like the community or the state or the region's readiness for collective impact. Are there influential champions in place? Is there the sufficient funding to really get the process started? Do we have start to the data that we really need? And those types of readiness factors are really important to think about. In addition, what are the economic conditions within which our initiative is happening so that we know the baseline off of which our progress will be assessed? And also, what is the state of political will related to our initiative? So those are just some examples of the types of things you might start thinking about examining in evaluation of the context in which the collective impact initiative sits. So that's the container. And before I go farther, one thing that often we get asked is, when should we start thinking about evaluating collective impact? When do we start thinking about evaluating our work? We know it might take a lot of time to ultimately make progress towards our North Star goal to increase graduation rates, to decrease recidivism, to decrease childhood obesity. But what should we be thinking about in the meantime? And so another framing for thinking about this framework is in answer to that, it is never too early to start. It is never too early to start thinking about evaluating the who, the how, and the why things are coming together as they are in the community. And that's where we start with this first block around collective impact design and implementation. And so in this chunk, this is in the early stages what we would want to think about evaluating. Yes, you're definitely going to be setting impact goals, but to know how or why you're making progress to those goals, it's important to also think about evaluating the design and the infrastructure that's coming together to facilitate the collective impact process. And that's what we talk about with the 5 conditions. So the ring with the five visuals that depict a common agenda, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, shared measurement, and the backbone. So those 5 elements themselves are really important to keep an eye on evaluating how effectively they're being put into place, to understand perhaps where you're hitting challenges in putting them in place, and how to learn about what's going well in putting that collective impact process in place. So that might sound like a process evaluation. And in some ways it is in the early stages, but it's really an important piece to helping you understand the how and the why you make progress. In addition, in those early phases, it's very important to think about evaluating the capacity of the organizations coming together to do this work. So this was touched on in one of the questions. You know, how do providers and partners coming together, do they have the capacity to be collecting data and sharing data? And if not, what can we as a backbone or our partners do to strengthen that capacity? So looking at the capacity of the collective is really important in the early stages as well. In addition, in the early stages, we want to emphasize looking at the culture, the learning culture of the partners coming together. As Faye mentioned, of course, learning is something that is incredibly important and a core part of what makes collective impact effective, learning as a collaborative about what's working and what's not. But in order to get there, you certainly need a learning culture. People need to have the trust in order to share information and the relationships to do that. And so not forgetting to attend to potentially evaluating the learning culture within which the conversations are happening. So that is a lot. The guide that we have will have sample outcomes and indicators for each one of the 5 conditions, for evaluating capacity, for evaluating the learning culture. We'll give some samples in a minute. But the important thing to know with evaluation, as any evaluators in the room know, is everything is going to be guided by what you need to know at that point in the initiative to help you make progress. So while it might seem overwhelming to think about evaluating everything at once, this is the holistic framework, and then evaluation questions can help guide where you focus. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but I want to provide that framing for this seeming very large and overwhelming as potentially a huge amount to evaluate. So in the early years, let's roughly call it maybe 12 to 18 months, it makes a lot of sense to focus on understanding the context and the design and implementation of the initiative itself. Moving forward, it's when we start to think about looking at changes in systems and behavior. So system changes, changes in funding flows, philanthropic funding and public funding, both. To what extent are those funding streams being directed towards the priorities of the common agenda? To what extent are funders coming together to do co-funding or collaborative funding in new ways? To what extent are public and private funders working together? These are some of the things that you might look at in system change around funding flows. In addition, you're looking at changes in policy or changes in norms in the community. So those are some of the system changes that may be relevant to your initiative's evaluation in the intermediate phase. In addition, in this framework, we talk about changes in behavior in this intermediate phase. So that would be changes in individual behavior, community members' behavior. So if you're working on say a childhood obesity initiative, are members of the community behaving differently as a result of the work of the Collective Impact Initiative? Are more people biking or walking to work? Healthy eating, active living type indicators increasing at the individual level. So individual behavior change would be in this intermediate bucket. In addition, we're talking about behavior change of professional practice. So the providers in the community, as well as some of the system leaders. To what extent is the initiative able to influence and change the way that behavior of leaders, system leaders, and providers are changing as well? So in this middle bucket, those are the types of outcomes that you would want to be looking at, where you might develop indicators, of course, specific to the context of your initiative. And then finally, impact. We talk a lot about the process and the systems change, but we know what brings everyone to work every day is the desire for that impact. The framework, to be clear, doesn't go into all the details around ultimate impact evaluation because that's so specific to each and every issue area, community, region. But of course, looking at our ultimate impact goals and tracking progress over time is a core component of any long-term evaluation. So this is a lot, and this is the framework within which we think about diving deep on evaluation depending on where you are in the life stage of the initiative as well as what particular evaluation questions are important to ask at any given point in time. So this framework, just adding a little bit more to it, here we overlay a little more of an evaluator's lens. And the first thing I'll point out are the kind of the links between the design and implementation, intermediate outcomes, and ultimate impact. And those are really intended to represent continuous learning and the iterative nature of doing this work. This obviously, I'm sure you're thinking this is a vast oversimplification in a linear process. For a framework, we recognize that, but the arrows are really intended to represent the continuous learning and the point that this really is not a perfectly linear process. The color shading that we have represents the type of evaluation that would potentially make sense at each point in the sequence. So the light green over CI design and implementation, we have developmental evaluation. In the early days of an initiative, when we're still starting to ask, what is it that's coming together? What needs to happen as an initiative to begin to make progress? We think a lot about developmental evaluation as the appropriate approach. We have many resources specific to developmental evaluation we can point you to. This isn't a primer on developmental evaluation specifically, but in the early stage, we would encourage to think about the evaluation approach being developmental in nature. In the middle bucket, typically around when you're starting to see some intermediate outcomes. So that would be starting to see some shifts in systems, starting to see some individual behavior change or leader behavior change. We start thinking about a formative evaluation. So the key overarching question here, how well is this working? So you're starting to really look at indicators of progress using more of a formative approach. And then finally, when you're looking at the impact evaluation, over the long term, a summative approach. So this is looking back at what difference did it make? What did we achieve? So this is the most backward-looking evaluation. And we differentiate these because these lead you to very different questions and lines of inquiries in your work. Developmental, what needs to happen? What are we learning that can help inform how we move forward? Formative, how well is it working? What progress are we making? And then summative, did it work? What happened in order to codify that toward the end of an initiative? These, again, are very broad categories, and at any given time, you may be working on one or two of these different places in the framework, but it's important to think about different structures to the evaluation as you move through the lifespan of an initiative. Along the very bottom, we have a row that on the left, early performance indicators, and then the shared measurement system. So this is when it's up and operating. And this is really how I think about sort of the primary source of data. So in the early stages, early performance indicators really align with the development of the collective impact infrastructure and process. And the data that you would want to be collecting here would tend to be more qualitative in nature. You might be looking at surveys or interviews to answer questions around the development of the 5 conditions of collective impact. How is our backbone organization coming together? Are we helping to guide towards a common agenda? Are we helping to mobilize funding? And really reflecting on, again, the design of the collective impact process. The shared measurement system, which Faye will talk a lot more about, will focus much more on the measures of progress in the intermediate or ultimate impact stage. So these are the measures around looking at progress towards your end goal. You know, you have your shared measures that the collaborative agrees on. These will tend to be more of the impact goals or behavior change type goals that people in the collaborative are working towards. So what we're talking about here is early stages, more of the qualitative data around how the initiative is coming together, and then the shared measurement system for more of the quantitative data around the impact, around systems change, or ultimate change that we're hoping to see. So I mentioned learning. Junius.
On the 2 slides before in the impact, you've got developmental. Could you clarify that? And then on the changes in systems and behavior, are you talking about the ultimate target population behavior or the people around the table's behavior?
Great question. So to the first question around impact, long-term social and environmental impact goals, this is intended to acknowledge that collective impact often is used in a social setting, like a social change setting, but also an environmental change setting, so climate change or issues of trying to improve environment outcomes. To the other question around individual behavior and professional practice change, in the systems change bucket, this is primarily talking about change in community members, those who are beneficiaries or the target population, whereas change in behavior of the participants coming together. For the sake of this framework, we've put in the learning culture and learning capacity in the first bucket. The buckets are intended to be a framework to think about it. I think the point that you're raising, that it's important, I hear it's important to think about both of those. I would underscore, but where we would place them in the framework is what I just mentioned.
But the measures of the collective impact group, don't they continue across time? Because it seems the way it's up front on the left of the charts, that it's a time limited.
That's a really great point. I would suggest that we think of that as when it starts, and then it would continue. And that's a great clarification. So I mentioned learning questions. I just wanted to provide a few learning questions that are illustrative of the things you might use to frame inquiry at the different phases. So with context, again, I mentioned, what are the cultural, socioeconomic, or political factors that are influencing the design and implementation of our initiative? The CI design and implementation, just one illustrative question here around the backbone, but you might be asking questions around each of the different elements of collective impact, how they are coming into play. Intermediate outcomes, again, the changes in systems and changes in behavior, an illustrative question. To what extent and in what ways are the flows of philanthropic and public funding shifting to support the goals of the collective impact initiative? And then finally, number 4, impact. To what extent has the initiative achieved its ultimate outcomes? These are extremely illustrative, but we wanted to just share a few to make it real. So I want to take one more deep dive. I mentioned starting with evaluation questions, and then we move into, of course, as you're designing an evaluation, what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve and the indicators that let us know if we're making progress. And again, I can't emphasize enough that every initiative is so context dependent that indicators would look different in every community, but we're providing some as a guide, as a starting point to work off of, to think about what could make sense in your work. So a sample learning question: to what extent and in what ways is the backbone providing the leadership, support, and guidance partners need to do their work as planned? So sample outcomes might look like the backbone is effectively guiding the vision and strategy. And then we have some indicators. The backbone is maintaining hope and motivation. The backbone is celebrating and disseminating achievements of the partners, both in the collective and externally. The partners are looking to the backbone for support and guidance and leadership. So illustrative indicators that could tell you how the backbone is making progress on guiding vision and strategy. And then we have another one here. Again, we'll make the slides available. I won't read them all. But the backbone infrastructure, there are different priorities at any given time on what the backbone's focusing on. So you'd want to look at indicators of progress towards those. And then we can also think again about systems change. So questions such as, to what extent and in what ways are the flows of philanthropic and public funding shifting to support the goals of the initiative? So you might have an outcome that you look at around philanthropic funding in that issue is increasingly aligned to the goals of the initiative with some sample indicators. Or philanthropic and public funding is being targeted through partnerships or collaborative funding. So on the funder's behalf, are you seeing more co-funding? Are you seeing more alignment of philanthropic funds or public funds with some sample indicators? So I know that this is potentially a lot, and we're excited to be bringing you the guide that has, I would say, 5 to 10 indicators for each of the different outcomes at every point across. But we're hoping that this gives you a flavor of the kinds of outcomes and indicators that you would see at each point in the process. So we wanted to give you a chance to think a little personal reflection on what kind, based on where you are in your initiative, what kind of progress you're making. Think about what evaluation questions might be relevant for your initiative at this point. I'm not going to ask you to move. We have a packed house. But I want people to take about 5 minutes to think about where am I in our process and what evaluation questions are coming up for me that I would want to think about exploring through an evaluation. And then we're going to have you just share those with your table. I'm going to put the framework back up so you can think about that as part of it. And if you want, Faye and I can wander around and raise your hand if it would be helpful to have one of us come stop by. So take a few minutes to reflect on your personal initiative and questions, and then turn to share those with the table.
Great, we're all going to come back together now just to debrief a bit from that exercise. Would love to hear reactions from folks in terms of what this felt like. Was it hard to figure out what questions you're asking in your efforts right now? Any reactions or questions over here? Oh, do we have a mic? Great. We have a comment over here.
Hi, Cheryl Motor from the Childhood Obesity Initiative in San Diego. So we had one big question, and that is about causality. Because you can measure things in the first box, you can measure things in the second box, which we're all doing, hopefully. But how do you really show that that impacts everything in the third box? So it's causality or it's contribution, and how do you measure that? Because that is really crucial and key.
Great. No, it's a great question. And I think we talk about the framework overall as very loosely as a theory of change. And I hesitate to use that because it's such a loaded term. But the idea is that these things should build on each other, right? From sort of the left-hand side to the right. So ultimately, if you are designing and implementing the collective impact effort well, you have a strong and effective backbone, you've got clear common agenda, people are using the data effectively, then hopefully that is what is helping you to move to the next box around the intermediate outcomes. That's where you start to see funding flows shifting, right? Because it's clear what the goals are. You start to see changes in individual behavior. You start to see changes in professional practice, right? That ultimately, hopefully, get us to the impact on the right-hand side. So our goal, meeting the common agenda. But I would say that it is, while we're always looking for the connections between these things, it is very difficult to get to specific attribution of one thing to another. Ultimately, we're talking about systems change, right? There are many, many, many forces at work at once. The context is constantly shifting. You've got multiple organizations that are doing things, sometimes in collaboration and sometimes not. And so what we're trying to look is more at the contribution of these different pieces to the ultimate impact that we're trying to achieve. So I would really help you to sort of focus, move from attribution to contribution, and look for the relationships between these things. Another question that we had was, okay, we get it. We start with the, sort of the design and implementation on the left-hand side. So we want to first understand, do people get the common agenda and are they bought in? Is the backbone being effective? Okay, I get that. But then do I stop doing that once I move to the intermediate outcomes? And I think the answer is no. You want to constantly really focus on sort of, is the implementation of collective impact going well? And then how is that hopefully feeding into the intermediate outcomes and ultimately the impact that you're trying to achieve? But how you, sort of the resources that you spend on evaluation may shift over time. You may be spending more time sort of going out and understanding about how practice is changing in the world versus, really sort of looking internally at the backbone roles as you shift out and as the effort becomes more mature. Were there other questions or reactions? Again, I'm curious if it was easy or hard for you to figure out what are your big evaluation questions right now for the work? Any reactions to that?
I really appreciate this workshop because I'm worried about the sustainability of this beyond the power of personality of different specific people and organizations really owning and believing in this. And so I think the challenge for me is articulating in little boxes for people I worked with how to describe how people's behavior changes, how relationships change as a result of this work, so that 5 years down the road, whether they're working on this particular topic with me or they're doing something else in their local community, they do that differently as a result of the work and the experience they had with my particular phase of their life.
Yeah.
And so coming up with ways to describe that change of behavior and change of relationship in a way that's not too woo-woo.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
inspires
That's
them
concrete.
to maybe
Yeah.
step out of their comfort zone.
Yeah, and I think that this middle section is a big deal, right? I think that we're all very used to impact evaluations, and we're all quite used to sort of process and internal organizational type of evaluations. But this middle piece, how is behavior actually changing, and how are relationships changing, how are funding flows changing, is frequently missing when we look at how we're measuring change that's happening out in the world. And so getting quite concrete about, okay, what do we think is changing out there, and how do we measure whether or not it is changing, and how do we learn from that, is a critical part of collective impact. So I think that's right, sort of getting concrete and having, having people focused on, okay, these are the things that need to change, we believe need to change before we get to our common goal. Yeah, maybe one more question here.
This could be complicated. I have a question in our work around how our regional efforts are affecting or contributing to statewide efforts and vice versa. And so you're talking about multiple backbone organizations coming together in a state. Now, on 2 of our Cradle to Career initiatives, both around 3rd grade reading proficiency and quality improvement of out of school time programs. And so it's amazing and wonderful that our regional efforts are actually affecting some statewide work, but people at the state and other communities have different ideas too about what needs to be done, and it's getting messy. But I want to still remain on the positive that it's beautiful that at least we're lifting up these issues and more people are talking about them and sharing what works. Different ideas around evaluation and assessment tools and out of school time programs, where the lower half of our state is very advanced. And oh my God, I'm looking at Tim because he's part of that work. And if it changes at the statewide level, I will have a conniption fit. I will. But in 3rd grade reading proficiency, just different strategies all feeding into the whole of statewide policy and all this stuff. So I'm wondering if there are evaluation tools around how regional efforts affect and contribute to statewide efforts, vice versa.
It's a great question. I thought I saw Gabriel around here somewhere. You might want to talk to, there he is in the front. You might want to talk to the guys at Live Well Colorado, because they're always doing that, right? What's happening at the state level and then what's happening at the community level. There are a couple of really great collective impact efforts out there that have been wrestling with this for a few years. I would say that there are. But you're never going to get, if you have a statewide effort, you're never going to get all the communities implementing in the same way. That doesn't make sense, right? And so you need to be measuring different things at the community level, and ideally you want some common measures that are up at the state level as well. And ideally you want to create a learning community across the state for people to really be sharing what's working and what isn't. But Gabriel, maybe people can catch you afterwards around that issue. It's a great question. So thank you for engaging on this. I know that we started really big and really wide and really theoretical, but we thought it would be just hopefully a helpful frame for you. This Evaluating Collective Impact Guide will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. And in addition to the larger frame, we really want to make it useful. So you will see it's got an enormous appendix of all the potential sample questions that you might be asking at these different stages of the work, along with sample outcomes and indicators. They won't all be right, and they won't all be sort of directly relevant to your work, but hopefully it helps you get started, to start to pick and choose around, okay, what is important to us now, and how do we actually think about evaluating these things? There's also some guidance about how you actually do this work. You know, should we hire an external evaluator? Should we do it ourselves? How much does this cost? So we've included a lot of that kind of advice in the guide as well. So please keep tuned for it. You're part of this community of practice, so you will be receiving that when it comes out. But we also encourage you to engage on it. Talk to one another about it. You know, what's useful? How would you make it better? So it's a great resource which will hopefully be coming your way, very soon. So I'm going to transition us now from the big evaluating collective impact to perhaps the more bounded discussion around shared measures and the shared measurement system. And oops, actually, Jen, could you help me get that deck up, please? Thank you. So shared measurement, as you all know, is one of the 5 conditions for collective impact that we talk about. And frankly, as we talk with communities that are doing this work, shared measurement is probably one of the most challenging parts of collective impact, in addition to evaluating, that we hear about from communities that are really trying to do this work, but also one of the most important and the most powerful. And so when you think about shared measures, so we're really, just to very quickly define it, we're talking about a small set of measures that all the stakeholders really do agree to and that you measure in the same way over time, and the ability to learn from that, right? So that's what we mean by the shared measures and the shared measurement system. And there are huge benefits to doing this, right? And I don't have to tell you guys, this is probably pretty clear. It helps you to tell whether or not you are making progress toward the goal. Are we making progress? You need shared measures to tell you that, or else you're going to be like that pack of wolves howling at the moon, right? You need the data to tell you that. It actually does enable coordination and collaboration. If everyone's focusing on the same measures, it allows you to then talk to one another about how you're influencing those measures and hopefully really find ways to collaborate to help to move those measures together. It allows for that learning and course correction. Woof, this one's not going in the right direction. We need to try something different. We need to come at this in a different way. And interestingly, it really helps to catalyze action. We've seen that again and again. Peter Drucker says, what gets measured gets managed. There's a lot of truth in that. And so even if you take a really simple example, the college-bound scholarship example that we've given a couple of times, you know what? They were tracking weekly the sign-ups of the eligible kids that were getting signed up for college-bound scholarships. And that email was being emailed around to all the district superintendents, to the mayors, to the key parent organizations. And you better believe that when that weekly email came up, the mayor was on the phone to the superintendent, who was on the phone to the principal, saying, why are we last on this list? It really can, sort of the power of data to create focus and to really catalyze action is pretty incredible in this work. And then I would say also improve data quality, right? You may not have all the data that you need in the beginning. You may not have all the capacity to do it. But over time, if you have a really discrete, defined set of data points, that data is going to get better over time because people are really focusing on it. So there are a lot of real benefits to doing shared measurement. And I would say that as we've looked at how efforts really get shared measures in place and use them, there's roughly three different phases to developing a shared measurement system, right? The 3 Ds: design, develop, and then deploy. And so if you talk about this at a very high level, designing is where you get to a common agenda, right? How are we bounding this system or problem that we're trying to attack? And then going through a very iterative process of identifying those measures that we want to sort of define as those shared measures. So what is that small group of measures? And this is an iterative, long-term process. I'm going to get into this in a minute. This is much harder than it sounds. But really identifying that small group of measures, that's just the first step, though. So once you've actually identified them, then you actually have to create the capacity around that. You have to be able to collect that data consistently over time. You need to have the capacity to really start to synthesize that data and to share it with a lot of different organizations, which leads to that last and most critical piece, deploying. How are you actually using the data? So you've identified the measures, you're collecting it and synthesizing, but now you actually have to talk about it. What are we learning from this data? How are things moving? What seems to be working or not working? And that's where sort of the real magic of collective impact happens, right? Where you really get people to focus in on that data and it creates the dialogue around how to make things better, how to really move forward. So three rough phases for shared measurement. Now, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. This is hard stuff, right? There's a reason why shared measurement doesn't happen a whole lot naturally in our world. There are a number of big barriers to this. Just the fact that you've got so many different missions and organizational priorities, it's really hard to come to an agreement around a small set of measures that everybody buys into. There's a lot of fear around this work. Oh my gosh, this data is going to be public. How am I going to look against other organizations? You know, this comparative performance. That's really scary to a lot of organizations that are working on issues. There isn't a whole lot of capacity to the question, you know, sort of the comment earlier. It takes time and skill and capacity to be able to collect the data, let alone to use it. And then there's the funder question, right? Often you get lots of different funders with different data that they're requesting from grantees. Then those data don't necessarily line up with one another. So you've got a lot of funders that are asking for different data points. And then finally, of course, just this stuff is time consuming. And it can be costly to develop a really robust shared measurement system. So these are all real challenges. And I don't want to downplay them. But I would say that we have seen time and time again that efforts are really able to overcome these challenges and work with these challenges and get to a place where they have really robust shared measurement systems that are moving them forward. And so we'll talk a bit about sort of what we've seen to be a good way to move forward on this work. And there was a question up here. Yeah.
Have you ever run into someone who went back to the funders and said, this collective thing, we're all working together, would you renegotiate your measures so we can align?
Absolutely. We've seen great examples of collective impact efforts that have essentially formed a funders group within the larger effort. And a lot of what that funders group does is talk to one another about, oh, I'm funding here and I'm funding there, so there's coordination there. But it often gets to the point of literally, let's all ask for the same measures. Let's all ask for the shared measures. And we've seen that is incredibly powerful in terms of getting funders aligned on the data and the measurement. Yeah. Great question. Yeah, here.
Could you describe the butterfly net of how you get how you figure out who's collecting what data that might relate to your
Yeah. So I'm gonna get sort of into the nuts and bolts here, because I think that it's helpful to be specific, and we have found some real tips and tricks to doing this work after looking at how many different initiatives have come at it. So a few tips and tricks that I would just encourage you to keep in mind as you're developing shared measurement systems. One is don't do too many, right? Really keep it at a discrete number. I know it's hard, but you don't really want more than 15 or so. Top line measures that you are really focusing on. It doesn't mean that you can't measure other things, right? I talked about the Calgary Homeless Foundation. They got to eight measures on homelessness across Calgary. And then they have a whole HMIS system that they have built out, which is tracking a whole bunch of additional data in addition to those 8. But it's really 8 at the top line that everyone has agreed are the most important measures around homelessness in Calgary. So don't go too many. We see a lot of efforts. Strive in Cincinnati talks about the mistake they made, where I think they had 64 initial indicators around cradle to college and career. They have a whole lot less than that now, right, as they've matured and realized the power of having a smaller set. The other piece that we have seen, oh, sorry, yeah, question.
When you're saying indicators, you're not talking about data points, you're talking about priorities.
They are data points. They are measurable indicators. Yes. Thank you for that question. This is data. These are things that are measurable. Okay. And I'll get to this in a minute in terms of the criteria, but thank you for clarifying that. And it actually leads me to this next point around having a set of criteria. So again, when you are developing shared measures, this can be a fairly political process, right? People want to see their own organizational measures included in whatever this small set of shared measures is around an issue. And so what we have found to be really helpful to kind of dispel some of the politics around this is developing a really clear set of criteria right up front. How are we going to determine what the shared measures are? And I'll go through an example list. Strive actually developed a great list when they were first doing this in Cincinnati that they use across the network now. But things like, does the data already exist? Is it linked, scientifically to the common agenda that we're where's the evidence that it's linked to the common agenda that we're trying to achieve? Those kinds of really basic ground rules. And that way, when you get to that, sort of through the process of developing the shared measures, folks can say, but my measure's not there, but I understand why It doesn't meet these criteria. I get it. And that can be really, really helpful in sort of helping to navigate this process. In terms of collecting the actual data and sort of defining them too, we find that it's really helpful to be specific and time-bound, right? And ideally that you are actually reporting progress relative to targets, right? So set a goal and have ideally a time by which you want to reach it, and then look at how your progress is tracking against those things. Use data on whole populations when possible. So really try to go for that broader coverage. And when you're reporting data, we found it can be very powerful to use numbers as well as percentages. Okay? So not only are you trying to double the number of post-secondary attainment in your community, but that means X number of kids. And frankly, that often makes it feel much more tangible and much more real. These are actual kids, right? So use numbers as well as percentages. And then, of course, this goes without saying, but this often isn't done. Start where there already is data being collected. Leverage the existing efforts that are already underway, right? So if there is a state plan for early learning, use those indicators. A lot of people probably worked on that to develop those. Another key best practice that we see is find your data experts and keep them close. Create a data committee. This is a volunteer group of folks. You know who they are around your issue. They are the data geeks. They might sit in public agencies. They might sit in school districts. They might sit in universities. But these are people that love data and really understand data. And what you should do is create a committee of your data geeks and use them, standing committee, use them all the way along. Use them to help you inform what the right shared measures are. Use them to help sort of settle disputes over cohort definitions. Use them to help you adjust the data as you go along, because you will come back and adjust some of those shared measures. So having that data committee is a huge best practice. It's very, very valuable. And again, can help you work through some of the politics. Well, our data experts wrestle with this problem, and here's the answer. People usually are fairly comfortable with that. Great. Any questions on this? Yeah.
And how do you think through if your collective is doing a treatment on a target population, but your goal is to influence, say, countywide or statewide numbers? How do you sort of parse out kind of your how do you think through the evaluation of like measuring the big goal versus those who are actually getting the treatment?
So this is a really good question. I think that it's important to think about the different types of data that you're collecting and for different purposes, right? The shared measures are typically up at the top level. They're that 15 or less set of measures that are really linked to the goal that you're ultimately trying to achieve, and you need to track that over time. But you might have specific work groups that are working on a specific population or a specific part of the problem. They need to also be collecting data on a regular basis and using that to learn and course correct. But it's really that work group that's focusing on collecting that data and using it, rather than the shared measures which sit up here and that you really want to have everybody looking at and working on over time. Does that make sense? Answer your question? Yeah. Another question here? Yeah.
And bear with me if this isn't really clear, but I think there's a challenge in evaluation and having some of these measures and having something that's doable so that you can get to that mission accomplished. So we want to get from 20% to 30%. But then in so much of collective impact, I feel like we work at vision level. Mm-hmm. So we want all of our kids to read at third grade reading level or above.
Yeah.
And so how do you work with those two things?
It's a great question. Sort of, how do you set your common goal or agenda even? Do you go for realistic or do you go for aspirational? And we've seen so many communities wrestle with that question, and we've seen them kind of go either way. I think either way is fine. But regardless of whether you're going realistic or aspirational, have it be measurable and time-bound. And I think that sort of the context is going to tell you what the right way to go is. Does that answer? I know it depends type of answer, but it really does depend. Yeah. So I'd love to just walk through a specific example of developing shared measures, because I think that helps to make it real. The example that I'm going to use is the Roadmap project. So we've been talking a bit about this effort the last couple of days. This is in South Seattle, South King County, and it's a cradle to college and career effort. And this is the goal. okay? This is the common agenda that this group of stakeholders came to after many, many, many months of working together. More than 300 people were engaged in coming up with this, 300 people and organizations engaged in coming up with this common agenda. And that is that the Roadmap Project's goal is to double the number of students in South King County and South Seattle who are on track to graduate from college or earn a career credential by 2020, time-bound, right? And we're committed to nothing less than closing the unacceptable achievement gaps for low-income students and children of color, and increasing achievement for all students from college to career, right? So there's the whole group, and then there's also closing the achievement gap. So it's almost like a two-part goal that they came up with, okay? So how did they go about figuring out a shared measurement system around a goal like this? This is a good goal, by the way, okay? It's specific. It's time-bound. They have geography, sort of what's in, what's out. It's cradle to college and career. It's in school and out of school. It probably is not focused on housing, right? So it's fairly clear in terms of the bounds. So how did they go about doing it? Well, in Seattle, what they did was we set up 4 different work groups across that cradle to college and career continuum. And that was very basic sort of early learning, so kids from birth to kindergarten, essentially. And then K-12 in school, K-12 out of school, and post-secondary. So very roughly chunking it up, okay? So 4 different work groups that worked on it. There were about 12 people on each work group. All of the work groups were cross-sector. These 12 people met once a month, and they had work in between, okay? And their remit was to identify the key measures within their part of the cradle to college and career problem, okay? And we gave them a set of criteria to use in establishing those measures, and we said, all right, you can only come up with 15 for your part of the continuum. So they were limited in terms of how many they could come up with. And they use these criteria to help them to identify and to prioritize those indicators. And there was a lot of debate within each of these 4 groups about, okay, well, what is the highest priority measures? How do we make sure that everyone's represented? What is the linkage to the common goal? And they really wrestled with this over a series of months in each of these 4 groups. Then there was the calibration across groups, right? Because you can imagine that there's an important linkage between what's happening with kids when they're at home before they go to school, and then what happens to them once they hit the K-12 system, and what's happening in the K-12 system, and then, of course, what's happening in post-secondary. So the heads of those working groups were constantly calibrating with one another to make sure that they weren't missing anything as you move from one of these work groups to another. And so essentially, in the end, let me go through this, sorry, just very quickly on the criteria, and these will be available to you. Just some really useful criteria, and again, these are developed from initial ones that were developed by Strive. But are the indicators linked to the ultimate goal, right? These are really basic criteria, but very, very helpful ones. Are they easily understandable? Are they actually sort of collectible? Does the data exist, and does it exist consistently? Can it be disaggregated by ethnicity and specific groups? Really important in the roadmap's case, since one of their goals is to close the achievement gap, right? Can these indicators actually be influenced? Can we change these indicators, right? So very clear criteria that were helpful in helping to select these and get around a lot of the politics around shared measurement. And so ultimately, again, after several months of these 4 working groups working together and reaching out to the broader community, they had focus groups of the broader community, they had surveys around which measures were most important. Ultimately, they were able to come back together and come up with this set of indicators from essentially cradle to college and career in Seattle. And when you look at these indicators, they're pretty intuitive, right? Kindergarten readiness, 3rd grade reading, post-secondary attainment. But the process by which this group went through this, again, very iterative, using work groups, reaching out to the broader community, really meant that there was huge buy-in to these measures in the end. And that has been really critical to their success. The other thing that they did was they then went out and collected baseline data across all of these measures. So they had a clear starting point. We've got a clear starting point for each of these measures. And then they set goals. So they had 2020 goals, of course, for doubling the number of post-secondary and closing the achievement gap. But they set interim goals for 2014 and for 2017. And that really helped to focus those working groups in on where to start first, right? Where are our biggest problems? Where do we have momentum? And setting those interim targets has really helped them in terms of figuring out where to get started in the work. Yeah, go ahead.
So
Yeah.
So this is a part where a lot of the indicators seem like they're readily available. Like
Yes.
school districts already collected a lot of that information.
That's right.
But for example, the one about percentage of children ready to succeed in school, I would think they would need some sort of proxies or set of data for that. And
That's
then
right.
my question is around when we get down to this level, there's all kinds of issues around the expense and the logistics of collecting the data. So you have lots of different partners, even though they may be bought in, they still need resources or a mechanism. So are you going to talk about that?
Yeah, so it's a great point. And in Washington State's case, we have just gotten to the point where we have, kindergarten readiness standard. And that's now being rolled out. And for the roadmap project, they are using those early pilots and the data from those pilots and ultimately the kindergarten standard itself to sort of fill in this data. But it's an ongoing discussion about which parts of that kindergarten readiness assessment and how the data is collected and used. And that's where your data experts come into play. There's a whole group of folks in the early learning part of the spectrum that is really focused on figuring out what data, how are we collecting it, how are we using it, right? They do. There is an assessment and there is data that's available. Now there is another example though around youth development, right? Very, very nebulous space and a lot of qualitative measures. In the space of the 6 to 8 months or so that it took to come up with this shared measurement system, the youth development folks, the people in K-12 out of school, did their absolute best and they came up with some good sort of healthy youth survey type of measures. But they said, you know what, we aren't comfortable with this. We need to spend more time. And then they spent another year after that, the King County executives for youth development really trying to develop very specific measures around the softer out-of-school youth development. And they all, after another year, were able to come to agreement about what those measures were and how they were going to measure them. So there are areas where the data is not necessarily available, where it's not clear. And that's where you really need to have folks focus in to say, okay, well, we're going to figure this out. What are we going to measure? And it's a proxy, and then move forward from there. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Question here and then over there.
I really appreciate you saying, these are intuitive, but it was the process as well, because I think that, there's often this resistance, particularly when people just kind of want to get her done, to not slow down and do this kind of work. But if you approach it from a relationship building, team strengthening, communication strategy, in the process, and then hypothetically it gets you on the map around collaboration being that much more impactful rather than sort of I think it would be easy to almost be somewhat apologetic about taking time off of task to do this, but if you see it from an organizer's perspective of the process being...
Absolutely. The process is absolutely critical. I mean, you could have started with these. I mean, you look at these are really intuitive. You could have said, okay, here's a set of measures. Let's move forward. But they would not have gotten the degree of buy-in. I have spent 6 months of my life, in regular meetings wrestling with this. And I've also been thinking about, okay, well, what is the work that I'm actually doing in my organization? How is that related to moving that specific indicator? So it's the process that is so valuable here. So I'm going to go over here and then here. And then I know we've got to, go ahead.
Could you speak a little bit to the pluses and minuses of using already reliable and validated tools? Coming from education, out of No Child Left Behind, it's all been about test scores and a lot of out-of-school people supporting developmental assets. So could you talk a little bit about the pluses and minuses of using an existing tool for data collection?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think these are the important conversations that need to happen through this process. I think that there was an acceptance when these working groups were spending the time together that there's a lot of test score data in here, third grade reading and fourth grade math and proficiency levels, that those are an incomplete proxy for a lot of the youth development things that this group is interested in. But I think that there was agreement that this is okay for now and we're going to move forward with it. At the same time as there was a discussion about, okay, but we also need the softer youth development measures and we're going to spend a year figuring that out, right? So I think that the value is in having the conversation about it. We know it's not perfect, but it's a proxy that we have now and that we can use, and then let's help to develop the other pieces that we think are missing over time and fill those gaps in. That makes sense? Yeah. Yep, here.
Yes.
Yes. So again, one of the really important criteria for the indicator selection was that the data could be disaggregated. So they were really looking for data points that could be disaggregated by race and by gender and by background, by income, because that is such a critical, it's sort of at the heart of the goal for the effort. That isn't necessarily true for everybody, but that ability to disaggregate data is really critical in this case. Yeah. Yep, question here.
Just wondering, in terms of the trade-off in time between spending another year trying to get buy-in on the measures versus spending that same year trying to get buy-in on the strategies and the mutually reinforcing activities.
Yep.
Because you only have so much time and so much.
Yeah, no, it's a great.
People.
It's a great point. So I would say that in the roadmaps case, the process from beginning to talk about measures to this set of measures was 6 months. There was then another year of figuring out those really softer, more nebulous youth development measures where the data wasn't obvious and it didn't exist. But that year was not just about the discussion of measures, right? The King County Executives for Youth Development were meeting because they were talking about measures at the same time as they were talking about the interventions. And those two things were really a back and forth conversation. It wasn't just a discussion about data, but it was a discussion about how do we know that youth are developing in the ways that we need them to develop and that we're supporting them in doing that. So it was a much broader, more strategic question that helped them to cycle back to those measures. It wasn't a year wasted just talking about data. It was a year of building the relationships between these different groups and getting input from others to the point where people were really bought in around, okay, now we're comfortable with the proxies. It didn't mean that the planning and the work wasn't happening at the same time. And I think that's one of the key things here is that as you form these work groups, whether it's talking about data or strategies, you need to be talking about the data and the doing at the same time, right? They shouldn't be pulled apart. So if you're talking about third grade reading, you very quickly then say, okay, well, how do we move this indicator? What do we think are the big levers for change to get third grade reading numbers to move? And that's when you get, well, we need the libraries, and we need the doctor's offices, and we need the parents, and we need the early learning folks, right? So the data conversation very quickly leads into how do we then make change against this? Yeah. Yeah.
Do you track, I see these are mainly like social indicators. Do you know of anybody tracking the financial side or the cost side to prove out the investment?
That's a good question. There are a couple of specific efforts I can think of that do that. I would say that for the shared measures, we really emphasize population-based measures, right, around sort of impact. That doesn't mean that you can't also track helpful process measures and cost savings measures, those kinds of things. That could be very helpful for communicating. But for the shared measurement system, we really encourage that to be as population-based as possible, or obviously in the environment, sort of. That's right. Yeah.
The Pew Foundation, in conjunction with the MacArthur Foundation, has a project called Results First, and they do impact based on ROI. And there's also some data with this connected to the Washington Institute on Public Policy.
Great, thank you. All right, Junius. Yeah.
I know that y'all take a no blame sort of approach to this, but it seems to me that under this level, there's like most of the big systems, with the exception of the schools, which through No Child Left Behind and through state legislation, they figured all of this out, whether you like it or not, believe in tests. Below that, though, we've got all these other systems who are contributing to these outcomes for kids who have no standards of accountability, no performance measures. And I just worry about whether not getting into that part of it leaves them off the hook in terms of really restructuring their performance to really serve the kids in the family. I mean, healthcare services, social services, all these other folks. So below this, are they really articulating a lot of systems performance measures?
Yeah, so this is a great question, Junius, because you look at this set of measures and you think, well, that applies to the schools, and we'll leave it at that. I think that one of the key things, sort of once these measures are in place, is helping different systems see themselves in the measures, right? So take the third grade reading example. Because of the work groups all shifted, after they developed the data, and they shifted to looking slightly different as they developed strategies. There's now a birth to third grade working group. And when they look at that third grade reading indicator, they're not just thinking about schools, right? They are thinking about libraries. They are thinking about doctors' offices. They are thinking about family, friends, and neighbors networks, and in some cases, housing authorities, literally. And very explicitly bringing those cross-sector actors together on those working groups to figure out what are the big levers for change that we can get at by bringing these different systems together to move that third grade reading number. And what's been interesting about watching this take place over time is that the libraries are a major player in the K to third grade group. The doctors and healthcare providers are a major player in the birth to third grade group, and there are some great programs that are being sort of scaled up around that. But it is really getting the different systems to engage on key measures, and having those key measures identified helps to bring them to the table, helps them to find that focus and figure out how they fit in. But it's a great question. It's a great question. Thank you for that.
Measures for their performance within those systems?
That's right. They are accountable for third grade reading levels moving, right? And so really helping folks to see themselves in the work and engage around those measures, even if it's not their traditional domain, is a key part of this. So I know there's a lot of questions, and I think we're almost at the end. I just wanted to cover just a couple more things in terms of not just the data and the use of data, but the communication of data, which is so powerful in this work. I'd encourage you to check out the Roadmap Project's website. It's roadmapproject.org. They have a great data report. So they did a baseline data report, and now they publish annual data reports, which disaggregates these key measures by district, by demography for the kids. And that disaggregation really helps to tell the story. The other thing that they do, which I think is really helpful in this work, is they have what they call bright spots. Where is the data moving? Where does it actually look good, right? What can we learn from where things are going in the right direction? One of the 7 school districts in this very high poverty, very diverse geography has really good third grade reading scores. It's exactly the same kids in terms of mix as the other districts. What are they doing well, right? So how do we learn from the really bright spots in the data as well? And then this is just an example of sort of how the data is disaggregated over time. So don't underestimate the power of using data to communicate about the issue, to create momentum, and to give credit, right? Really focus on what's working. So I'm going to stop us there. This has been such a rich discussion. I wish we had another hour for your questions, honestly. They're so great. I would just remind you that sort of going back to the first part of our conversation, the Evaluating Collective Impact Guide will be out very soon. So really encourage you to look for that. Hopefully it will be very helpful in helping you to guide how you think about evaluating your overall effort. And keep at this. Don't lose the data. The data, evaluation, shared measurement is really at the heart of collective impact and really making progress, in addition, of course, to the trust and the relationships without which this wouldn't be possible. But it really is data. We need the data to help to continue to improve and make real progress against these issues. So thank you all for a great session. Really appreciate it.